Hi, and welcome to another Digital Photo Mentor Lightroom tutorial. In this video, I'm going to walk you through using the sliders in the basic panel. If you use Photoshop, the same sliders appear in the Adobe Camera Raw basic panel as well, so you can follow along with the same tutorial. I'm going to open up Lightroom and I'll meet you back there in a moment. Okay, I am in Lightroom. This is Lightroom CC or Lightroom 6, but most of the same things will apply if you're also using Lightroom 5. Some new sliders did change between 4 and 5, so if you're not seeing the same ones that I have, you may need to update to Lightroom 5 or 6, or consider investing in the Creative Cloud so you'll always have the current version. So try and follow along, even if you don't have the same ones, they're going to be similar. And I'm going to tell you what each of the sliders in the basic panel do and when you want to use one over the other, because they're kind of a dance that you play between them, especially when you're playing with exposure and whites and blacks and contrast and things like that. So I've made a selection of a few images that I took on a recent trip to Cuba, one of our photo tours, that are going to demonstrate some of these sliders. Okay, as you can see, we're in the library module. To get over to the develop module, you can either just click develop or you can hit D on your keyboard. So first I'm going to start with the first bit of the top of this panels in the basic, which is the white balance and tint. The one I'm going to use to demonstrate that is this one of the flag here. So I'm just going to hit D on my keyboard. I'll give you the keyboard shortcuts as I go along. It's a good idea to try and remember the most popular ones. Okay. I'll share with you an article on the site if you look down below the video where I shared some presets and a PDF that you can print out as a cheat sheet for you as well. Okay, so now we're over in the develop module. You can choose to show the thumbnails at the bottom or not by using this little triangle at the bottom here to hide or show it. I'm going to hide them for now just because we don't really need to see them and I want you to focus on the image and what we're doing to the image. Right? Inside the develop panel on the left, you'll see presets, snapshots, history, and now collections are in there as well, so you can change image collections. I'm going to leave the history panel opened so that you can see what is being done to the image as we go through it. Okay, now you can see that there's some things that have been done to this image, but basically what I've done is I've reset everything back to how it came out of camera. Okay, so that's the first thing I want to show you is the reset button, which is down at the bottom here. Okay, bottom right. If you've made a complete mess of your picture and you just want to start over, just click reset and it will set everything back to 0. Okay. So the first thing we're going to look at is the top of the basic panel. Okay, if you're not already in the basic panel, make sure that you have this one opened and not one of the others. Okay, these are all the ones that are available in the develop module. If you're working on a laptop like I am, something that's really great to do is actually go into something called solo mode. Okay, if you right click on the word, okay, so not on the triangle but on the actual word right here where it says basic, you'll get this panel coming up. And make sure that solo mode has a check mark next to it. I'll show you what it does if I untick it. Okay, what happens is if I open the tone curve panel, let me just zoom back out, and then I go and open a different panel, now they're both opened. So you could end up with a whole big long scrolling mess if you want to get from one to the other because they stay open until you close them. Okay, so right click, choose that solo mode again, and then what happens is you can only have one panel open at a time. Okay, so if I open the tone curve panel just by clicking on it, it's now closed the basic panel. So it just keeps this panel easier to see one thing at a time and instead of having to scroll up and down a whole lot. If you have a big monitor and you're working on, a 27-inch monitor, it may not be an issue, but if you're working on a laptop like me, it's great to use solo mode. Okay, so that's the first little tip. Okay, so we're going to look at these things at the top here, which is the temperature and the tint. Okay, so it's like controlling your white balance in camera. Okay, and if you've shot raw like I have, you will have the same preset options. If you click on this little pull down menu where it says as shot, anytime you see up and down arrows like that, it's a pull down menu. Okay, if you hover your mouse over things, it will tell you what they are a lot of times. Okay, so pull down that little menu and you can see all of the presets that you would have in camera. If you shot a JPEG file format, you would not see this, okay? You would just see auto and custom, and that's it, okay? And as shot. So because I have a raw file, I can just change the white balance to anything I think might be a better choice. So this was shot indoors in a building, and there's some fairly orange light here. So I'm gonna choose tungsten to see if that does a good job. Okay, that's pretty blue. So I'm going to undo that. Okay, so that is Command Z or Z if you're in the States. Okay, us Canadians, we say Z. So you'll have to excuse me if I say Z. It just means Z if you're in the US. Right, and that just undoes the very last thing that you did. Okay. The other thing you can do is double click anything to get back to default. Okay, so if you make a choice and you don't like it, I'll show you that when we get into exposure. You can just double click and it will set it back to 0 just for that one slider. Okay, so another way that you can adjust your white balance is using this little targeted adjustment tool. Okay, it looks like an eyedropper. If you hover your mouse over it, you can see that it says white balance selector tool. Okay. And what that does is if you click on it, it activates this little eyedropper, and you can see as I move it around the picture, look at the thumbnail on the upper left. Okay, so make sure you have your left panel showing, and as I move it around, notice how when I put it over something that's brown, it's making the picture very blue. So what it's doing is it's kind of like it's trying to filter out the color. So whatever you put your little eyedropper over, it's trying to make that color neutral gray. So as you can see, it's very yellow where I've put that. So opposite of yellow is blue. Okay, if I put it up here, you can see that it's making it sort of more pinkish color when the light up here is rather green. So I'm just going to put it over his beard somewhere in the middle and see what kind of color we get. And as you move it around, you can see it changes quite a bit. So you might get something that is close. I'm going to try and find something I like. Right? You might get something that is close and then just tweak it a little bit. So the key to using the eyedropper is you have to have something that is a neutral tone in your picture. So I know that this beard was black or painted black. The wall is white, but it's kind of dirty and it's probably got some yellow in it, so I wouldn't trust the wall so much. If you have somebody that's wearing a black shirt like I am, or a white shirt, you could use their clothing, or if you have a gray card and you use that in your picture, you would be able to click on the gray card. Okay, so what that's going to do is going to make it neutral. Now that doesn't mean that that's going to give you a perfect color, it's just going to neutralize it. So in this case, it looks like there's some mixed colors coming in, because I've got lots of yellow down in the bottom and the right hand side of the picture, and it's kind of blue in the other side. I would probably do what's called a local adjustment to this picture, but we're not going to get into that in this video. I'll cover that in another video at a later time, where you can make adjustments to only a part of an image. For now, we're just talking about the basic panel, which means anything you apply here applies to the entire picture. Okay, so we want to get the best color overall. Okay, if you go to your sliders, you also have the option of just sliding them. Okay, so you can grab the tint slider and move it from left to right. What I suggest you do is go to extremes. The best way to learn something is look at both extreme ends and see what it does. So let's drag the temp one all the way to the left. Okay, as you can see, it makes everything very blue. Now let's drag it all the way to the right. Now we have very yellow. Okay, neither is right or wrong. It's all about interpreting how you want your picture to look. So if you want it warmer, go more towards the right. If you want it cooler, go more towards the left. So let's pick something somewhere in the middle. That's not bad, right? The tint slider goes between green and pink or magenta, which is called in the photography world, right? If you're familiar with the term RGB, it means red, green, blue, and those are the layers that your picture is actually made up of. And you see it in your histogram up on the top right as well, the colors, okay? So if you drag this one to the left, you're going to get green. Okay, like so. If you drag it to the right, you're going to get pink, like so. So once again, find something that is pleasing for that individual picture. There is no right or wrong. And because there's a varying color shade in this image, I've got to pick something that's somewhere in the middle. So that's not too bad. Right? Now you might have to adjust the top one once you've adjusted the bottom one. Like I said, it's a dance between the various sliders. So when you slide one, you may find that after you do the second one, you have to go back and adjust the first one a little bit back again. Okay? So that is the temperature and tint slider. Let's take a look at one more image. Okay, this one here of my husband and a fellow smoking cigars. Okay, so it came out of camera and it was a little blue. So I could try my 3 methods again. I could choose the different presets. Okay, that definitely warmed it up so they're not looking so blue. That was cloudy. Okay, let's try shade, even warmer. Okay, let's try daylight. Okay, back to blue. So I think cloudy was the closest. I might just go with that. So that one was pretty simple, literally just choosing a preset. I could use the targeted tool and adjust based on his hat. I could give that a try. But there might be some different tone color of light hitting him versus hitting the other fellow. Yeah, it came out fairly blue. So I like what I got with cloudy. So there's that Command Z or Z to get back. So that one was pretty easy. Okay. Things like sunsets, you have a lot of artistic license with the sunset, especially in the range of color tone, okay, or white balance. Right? If you shoot the sunset with one of the cloudy or shade presets, it's going to come out warmer to begin with. So if you haven't done that, you can choose one of those and make your sunset warmer. So notice how when I go from daylight, it's more blue, to cloudy, it's more warm. Okay? Let's take it to extremes. Again, with the sliders, you can make your sunset really warm or really blue. So you get to decide completely how you want this image to look based on what you remember it looking like, how you want it to feel. Do you want it more pink? Do you want it more blue? Completely up to you. And sunsets are something that you can go crazy with your color and have a little fun with it. Okay? So that is the first section, which is our white balance sliders. Okay, the next one I want to look at is how all of the various exposure sliders work. Now I've got this image of a shadow on a wall that's fairly neutral colored, but I like it because it's got some extremes. So it's got some really bright areas and some darker areas. And we're going to use this one to demonstrate the sliders that are in the next section, which is tone. Okay, so tone has to do with how bright or how dark something is. And all of these sliders, I'm just going to zoom in a little bit here so you can see this. All of these sliders here correspond to an area on the histogram as well. So you see up here, when I put my mouse over this exposure slider, see how the area in the middle of the histogram sort of lightens a little bit? You can see that it's highlighted. Okay, so that's the area of the histogram that this slider is going to affect. Okay, if I put it over highlights, you see that it's the next area to the right. If I put it over white, it's the far extreme right of the histogram, which is pure white, the most lightest, brightest areas of your image. Okay. If I put it over shadows, it's the area to the left of the midtones. Blacks is all the way to the left, where your deepest, darkest shadows. Okay. So going back to exposure, you'll notice that it actually affects the midtones. Okay. So you can adjust exposure, again, a couple of different ways. You can choose auto here and see what Lightroom comes up with. Okay, just by clicking auto, that's what it gives me. Okay, is it right? Hard to say. Okay, I'm going to undo that. Okay, and if I want my exposure slider to go back to 0, click on the name, double click over the word itself. Okay, and it will go back to 0. So that's our little shortcut there. Okay. The other way that you can adjust the exposure or the midtones is actually on the histogram. So if you go up here, you'll notice that you get this little left and right arrows. Okay? So if you click and drag on the histogram in that area, it's going to affect only the tones in that section that are highlighted. So let's try that. Okay, so I'm going to click it and drag it to the right. Okay, which is going to brighten. So anytime the histogram moves to the right, things are going to get brightened. Anytime they move to the left, things are going to get darkened. Okay, so keep that in mind. So pulling to the right, Okay, so notice how the histogram is being pulled with me. Okay, let's pull it quite far. Okay, so it's brightening up the whole image gradually. Okay, so if we look at our exposure slider, it's now at plus 1.64. So it's increasing it 1 2/3 stops. Let's go the other way. So if we drag this minus, it's going to get darker. Okay, so that's what minus 0.52 looks like. Okay, so the whole thing got darker. Neither is right or wrong. You just get to decide how you want your image to look. Okay, let me go over some of the basics of setting your exposure if you want to make sure that it's within a normal histogram and you're going to have detail, right? Double click exposure for reset. Okay. If you set reset down at the bottom, it's going to reset everything. If you've done other adjustments like color, tone, or any, contrast or anything, it's going to reset everything. So if you just want to double click, if you want to reset one slider only, just do the double click trick. Okay. So with this guy, take a look at what happens when we adjust some of the other sliders. Okay, so I mentioned each one adjusts a different area on the histogram and a different tonal range of your image. Okay, so exposure is affecting only the midtones, and you saw what happened with the histogram when we dragged it left and right. Let's watch what happens when we do the white slider. Okay, so again, look at the histogram. It's highlighting that bit on the far right. So when I pull it to the right, it's going to brighten. Okay, when I pull it to the left, it's going to darken, but it's only going to affect those areas in that range. Okay, so as I go to the right, see, notice how the highlights got really bright. Okay, over the top bright, so that they're clipping. Clipping means that it is going off the edge of the histogram, like you see here. Okay, so it's hitting the side and it's got that spike going up, which means it's clipped, and there's going to be no detail there. Okay. There's a couple ways to show if you have clipped highlights or shadows. Right? You can hover over the little triangle up top in the histogram here. Now what you're seeing in red is every area that is not going to have any highlight detail. Okay? If you hover over the one on the left, that's going to show you shadows with no detail, and you can see that we don't have any. Okay? Let's take our white slider the other way now. Okay? So if we slide it to the left, it's darkening those those highlight areas, pardon me, the very whites. Okay, now if we hover over that little triangle, you see that we have detail on that wall in the brightest area. Okay, there's another little trick I want to show you. Okay, I'm going to reset. This one is really cool. There's two really cool tricks here. You're going to want to write these down if you haven't learned these ones. Click your Alt or Option key on your keyboard and hold it down while you grab the white slider. Okay. I'm going to drag it to the right, so see how my screen went black. Okay, what that's doing is it's showing me anything in white that is clipped. So right now I have no clipped highlights. That's a good thing. I'm going to drag the slider to the right, which is going to brighten my highlights. Now you can see it's showing me some clipped highlights. So a little trick that I like to share is drag your white slider until you have some clipping, then drag it slowly back to the right until they all disappear. Okay, so in this case, it went to about +5. What that does is it sets your whites to touch the edge of the histogram, but not go off the chart. Okay? Another way to do that is another little shortcut. Okay? Hold your Shift key this time and double click on the word whites. This works for the whites and for the blacks. So I'm going to hold Shift. I'm going to double click the white slider. And what it does is it sets the whites to just up to the point where they are clipping and touching the edge of the histogram. Okay? You can also click J on your keyboard to show areas that are clipping, and you can see that there's really tiny little bits here, but for the most part we've got detail in that wall, but it's going to be nice white. Okay? Now all of the same things apply to the black slider going in the other direction. Okay, so if I click Alt and click on it, anything it shows me here in a color or in black is a clipped shadow. Okay, in your image, if you get rid of all the clipped shadows, what happens is it tends to look flat. Okay? You need to have black in your image. That is the key to making your images have punch. I can't state that enough. This is another thing to write down. Okay? So I'm going to drag my slider to the left until I see some clipped shadows, and I'm leaving it there. Okay, so you can see the histogram has the spike on the left, it's going up the side, and it's making a clipped shadow. right? But it's adding some contrast to the image and giving it depth by having pure black in your image, right? To get a before and after to see what you've done so far on this image, use your / key on the keyboard, right? So it's very subtle at this point. We're just adjusting the whites and the blacks, right, to have a little bit of contrast. This is the first thing I do on almost every image, is I do the whites and the black sliders first, and then I do the exposure slider. Let me show you an example. Okay, so let's go back to our image of the flag on the wall with the Che Guevara painting. So I want you to look at the histogram. Okay, so we're going to adjust the sliders so that it has a better well-rounded histogram, because right now we don't actually have any whites. If you look at this histogram, there's a big gap between where the information ends and the right side of the histogram. That indicates that this image is slightly underexposed. Okay, so I want to show you a couple of different things. So we can actually increase that by increasing the exposure, okay, which remember grabs the midtones of the image, okay. So let's go to almost +1. So you can see that it brightens the entire image. So that is plus 0.85, okay. So almost a full image. I'm going to create a virtual copy. So what that does is it makes another thumbnail, so we can work on it in a different way to compare the two, okay. On your keyboard, hit Command or Control apostrophe, and it makes a duplicate. So it doesn't actually duplicate the image, it only makes a duplicate thumbnail for you to work on. Okay? I'm going to reset the exposure, and I'm going to do this one differently. So this time I'm actually going to do the whites and the blacks first, like I mentioned on the image of the shadow. So click your Option key and hold it down, and then click the white slider, drag it to the right. Now watch the histogram, it's stretching it out. So it's not stretching the midtones, it's only stretching the highlights. So it's going to touch the edge. So I've got a little bit of that top part of the images clipping. I'm going to leave it there because I'm okay with that. Bring it back a little bit. Okay, so we're at plus 62 on the whites. And look at the difference that it has made. So just a before and after, it's already brightened the image a whole bunch. Okay. Next thing we're going to do is the same thing with the black slider. Right now we have very little blacks clipping. I want to make a little bit more because that's going to increase the contrast and richness of the image. Okay, let's do before and after again. Here's the before. See how flat it looks? This one has a lot more punch. Okay, and notice I haven't changed the exposure at all. Now if I decide that I still want to make it a little brighter, I can grab my midtones from the histogram and just pull up the exposure a little bit, okay? Or I can pull my exposure slider. Another neat little trick with any slider, this works in Photoshop or in Lightroom, is to use something called a scrubby slider. You may have heard that term before and thought, well, what the heck is a scrubby slider? When you grab the slider with your mouse, it kind of goes quite fast, right? So it can go too far and it's hard to get sort of fine-tune adjustments. If you put your mouse over the number itself, I'm going to zoom in so you can see this. See how it gets this little finger with an arrow on either side, right? So what that is that's your scrubby slider. It can be a little tricky to find and grab the first time you use it, but I'm sure that once you figure this out, you're going to use this all the time for fine-tuning adjustments. Okay, so if you click there and start dragging, it goes much slower. So it drags in smaller increments, right? And that's a cool little trick. So let's look at the comparison here. I'm going to set the exposure back to 0. So the two images, this is the first one where I increased just the exposure. The histogram still isn't touching the right. We still don't have any nice pure white. We don't have any nice pure black. The image is fairly flat and a little bit washed out looking. And we've increased the exposure almost a stop. When you do that, when you push your images in terms of exposure, you're also going to gain some noise, right? Look what happens when we do just the white and the black slider. We stretch the histogram out, and in doing so, we may not even need to adjust our exposure or only a tiny little bit. Right? So try and use your whites and your black sliders first, before you go to exposure. And again, I'd use that as a dance between the two. If you feel that once you've done the whites and the blacks, you may need a little exposure. Once you've done the exposure, you may need to scale this one back a little bit as well. Okay? Let's look at one more example. Another one that works well is this fellow here, right? So I'm going to do the same thing. We're going to process this one two different ways. Now this one has the opposite problem. So if you look at the histogram, there is a gap on the left-hand side. Okay, what that means then is I've overexposed it. Okay, so you can see that the histogram is all the way pushed over to the right and is spiking, and you can see that there's some areas on his pants and in his hat there that are clipped. So I'm not going to have any detail in those areas. I would like to have that detail. Okay, so I'm going to turn off my display of the highlights. So that's J on the keyboard also displays those. Okay. So I'm going to do this two different ways. We're going to do the exposure again. Okay, so let's grab the exposure. You can do it from the slider or from the histogram. And let's just darken it a little bit until we sort of see some detail happening in those areas. Well, we got a little bit. Right? It's going to have to go quite far, really dark, before we start to see any detail in those areas. Right? Now he's pretty dark, and the background is dark. We still don't have detail in his pants. We're going to have to play with our highlight slider anyways. So let's do that. Right? The Alt key works on the highlight slider as well, and when you drag it to the left, you can see that the parts that are clipping disappear. Okay? Left is darker. Okay? So we can see now that he's got full detail, nothing is clipped. Okay? Let's give him a little bit more. Let's do it the other way now. Okay, so same as we did with the flag. Let's do the blacks first in this case because the image is too bright. I'm going to drag it over until I have some nice blacks. Okay. Now I know that my whites are too bright, so I'm actually going to bring them to the left. Okay, so I'm alt clicking on the slider, taking my whites to the left or darkening, and then I'm going to bring the highlights down as well until we have nothing clipped. Right about there. Okay. Now look at that. We have not touched the exposure slider, and it has brought down full detail into the image. Let's look at the two side by side. So this first one, where we just adjusted the exposure, it's minus 1.35. So that's 1 1/3 stops overexposed and adjusted with the exposure. The background looks a little bit flat. Right? This one here has a lot more punch. Look at the contrast. He's got nice bright colors. Okay? We could bring the highlights down a little bit more if we wanted a little more contrast and detail in the smoke. But there's way more punch in that image, and we have not touched the exposure slider. Okay, so one thing to take away from this is don't jump to your exposure sliders first just because it's at the top of the list. Go to your whites and your blacks and adjust your highlights and your shadows a little bit before you go to the exposure slider. Okay? Now we haven't talked about shadow slider very much. What does the shadow slider do? Well, in this case, this is actually a really good example. Right? What it does is it kind of is like a fill flash. If you bring it to the right, remember it's going to lighten. So it's like turning the lights on. Let's take it all the way. So remember, let's go to extreme. So all the way to the right is like turning the lights on in the shadow areas. All the way to the left is like darkening. Okay, so it's going only in those areas. And you can see where it's pulling the histogram again. So if you have an image that has a lot of contrast, you can bring up your shadows, okay, by using the shadow slider. Word of caution though, let's take a look at a different example. Let's go back to our guys here. They're smoking the cigars. Word of caution, when you're working with an image of people, you don't want to go too far. Okay? So let's do the same treatment on this. Let's bring our white slider up until we have some clipped areas and then adjust back. Let's make sure we have some blacks clipped. Okay? So there's nice contrast now. And they look a little on the pink side, a little sunburned. Let's just give them a little less sunburn, bring our tone back down. Right, so there's a lot of contrast in this image and the shadows are very dark. So this is a case where you could use the shadow slider to bring them up. If you go too far with the shadows, okay, they start to get overly light. This is all the way. you start to create almost like an HDR type of look. And when you have shadows that are overly light, your eye almost rejects it. So you still want to have shadows that have some depth, especially with people. You don't want to go too far because you can end up creating something that looks like this, okay? And that just is not attractive look for any person, okay? So the key to the shadow slider is moderation, okay? Moderation with the shadow slider, especially dealing with people, okay? Something like that, okay? You can also do the same thing, sorry, let me go back again, with the contrast slider, right? What the contrast slider does is it compresses your histogram, it squishes it together, okay? So let's take a look at the contrast slider. If we move it to the right, it's going to increase contrast, okay? So the darks get darker and the lights get lighter, right? In this case, for this image, that's not what we want. Let's go the other way, okay? So the darks get lighter and the lights get darker, thus squishing it, okay? So there's less contrast. Same thing, you can go too far with this one as well. So use it in moderation. I don't use the contrast slider as much as I use the adjustment for the highlights and shadows and for the blacks and the whites, because I can control areas of the image as opposed to the whole image, if that makes sense. Okay, let's go back to our grid. And to get back here, I'm just typing G on the keyboard, which takes me back to the library module using the grid mode so I can see my thumbnails. Okay, the next thing I want to look at is the histogram again and show you what a good histogram looks like. So they say a lot of things about histograms and how a histogram should look, and often you'll hear things like it needs to be a nice arch in the middle. Well, take a look at this image. We've got exactly that. We've got a beautiful spike in the middle. But to me, this image looks overexposed, right? It was taken in a dark bar, and I know that the lighting is dim and the rest of the area should be dark, so to me it doesn't look right. It's not representative of the scene. This next image I took a little bit darker, and you can see that for me this is more representative of what it actually looked like in the scene when I took the picture, okay? If I do my little magic on the white slider, okay, you can see that the areas that are clipping are the light. This is another good example to use on the shadow. If you want to brighten the shadows a little bit, it's kind of like turning the lights on in the bar. Okay? And I might bring my exposure up ever so tiny a little bit. And that's about it. Okay? That's what I would do to this image in terms of brightening or darkening. It was pretty close to begin with. Okay? Just a little bit of contrast. Okay? If we want this one to look similar, we're going to bring the exposure down. Let's see, almost a stop. So that's 2/3 less exposure, okay, to get something similar. If we look at my camera data, this one was shot at f4.5 at 1/9 of a second. I was using a tripod. Okay, you notice that the ceiling fan is moving and you can see it. This one was shot at f4.5 at a 1/20th of a second. Okay, so it was a good 2/3 of a stop less exposed. But for me, this is the better, more correct exposure, even though this one had the nice arch on the histogram in the middle. Okay, so I'll point you to an article that I did actually on Digital Photography School on histograms, and also one on Is My Snow Gray? How do I know when I have a good exposure? To help you understand how to read exposure histograms when you're shooting so that you get the best exposure in camera. Okay, so all of this stuff we're doing in Lightroom and in Adobe Camera Raw, you want to avoid doing too much of this and get it as right as possible in camera so that you get the highest quality of image. Okay. Okay, what's next? Okay, the next one we're going to look at is the clarity slider. So I'm going to choose this old car, Savannah old car. So Cuba is known for its vintage vehicles. Clarity is slightly different than contrast and slightly different than sharpening. Excuse me, and slightly similar. Okay, what it does is it increases something called local contrast. I'm just going to zoom in on this, so you can see what it does when I pull the contrast slider all the way to one direction and then the other. You can see there's a lot of sort of texture and bumps and rust things on this car. When I bring the slider to the right, it's going to increase local contrast. Okay, so anything that has an edge, Lightroom's going to find that and increase the contrast between the light and the dark of the edge of that thing. Okay, let's see what it does. So it kind of gives it that crunchy, grungy kind of look. Okay? Just moving around our image, you can see that it really enhances the texture, especially down here on the ground. Look at the leaves. Okay? So before and after. Okay? So we haven't changed the contrast at all. Clarity has done that. Now let's see what happens when we go the opposite direction. And I'm going to put it on this chrome just to show you what it does there. Okay, all the way the other way, you see it's almost glowing, especially the areas that are the brightest or highlights. It has almost a glowy type of effect. Okay, now neither is right or wrong. See the whole image, the car, look how smooth the car looks. Okay, neither is right or wrong. Again, it's about the look you want for your image and moderation. Okay, so let's take a look at an example where moderation is a good thing. Okay, we looked at our smoking fellows. Let's go to them again. Okay, so if we take them to extreme one more time, let's go to 100% clarity for the fellows. Okay, this does not do a good thing for people. Okay, it makes the face look really crunchy. You can see I've got a lot of grain here at ISO 2000, but it makes every bump and pore and wrinkle on the face stand out. Okay, so I don't want to do that to this poor fellow. Let's see what happens when we do it the other direction. Okay, so if you want to soften things and you want to have something that's glowy or pretty, like maybe a flower or a lady dancer or something like that, men don't want to glow quite so much, but you want to be, again, moderate with your use of the clarity slider, especially with people. Okay, where you can take it to a far degree is something where, you know, our flag wall, again, let's go back to our flag wall, where it has a lot of texture and there's nothing that is going to object to having that texture added to it in the picture. Okay, so again, keep in mind that the clarity slider applies this to the entire image. Okay, any local adjustments that you do would only apply to a portion of the image. Okay, I'm going to show you a quick trick. Keep in mind this is something to use if you're using the adjustment brush or the graduated filter or the radial filter. Okay, if I apply plus 100 over the entire image, it's giving clarity to every area. But if I want to focus my attention on the fellow and not on this textured area in the bottom right, it's taking too much of my eye. I want to actually remove the clarity from that area. There's a little trick here. So I'm going to apply a graduated filter, and I'm going to apply it from the bottom corner up, and I'm actually going to make it minus 100. Okay? What it does, in effect, is cancels it out on that section. Okay? Because plus 100 and minus 100 equals 0. Okay? So let me show you a before and after. Look carefully at the flag and the fellow painting, and you'll notice that the bottom right corner isn't changing, only the wall up above is. Okay, so the clarity is only changing in the part that I didn't mask off with the filter. Okay, so that's just a little trick. I'll cover that in more detail when I get into sliders for the local adjustments in another video. Okay? So clarity slider, again, it adds a lot of sort of grunge and crunchiness. Use in moderation unless you have something that has a lot of texture and can handle taking the clarity all the way, like this wall as well. Okay, especially if that's something that you want to feature in your image. Okay. Next one. Okay, so we're getting to the end of the section here. Let's take a look at this leaf image. Okay. Light coming through a leaf or foliage looks really great because it gives it so much color. Okay, but there's a couple of things wrong with this image. First of all, let's look at our histogram. Okay, what does this tell us based on what we see in the histogram? What does it tell us about our image? Well, I can see that there's no blacks because it's not touching the left side of the histogram, and there's really no whites because it's not touching the right side. So it's very flat. Okay. The bottom sliders here that we haven't covered yet are vibrance and saturation, and the reason I leave those to last is because I always say touch them last. Okay, we look at this image and you might think, oh, I really want that green to be a lot more punchy. Okay, so we can increase the saturation and you can get something that has some nice green. Okay, but be careful of doing so. Okay, because if you do the other little tricks like my little white, shift double click, and my little black, shift double click, anytime you add contrast, it's going to add saturation. Right? Do you see how that increased the color again? Now let's move the saturation back to 0. Okay? So we have not touched the saturation now. We've only touched whites, blacks, and contrast and clarity. And look at how much more color the image has. So that's why I always touch vibrance and saturation very last. Do all your contrast adjustments to everything else first, and you may find that you actually want to turn the saturation down a bit, not up. Okay? Let's take a look at another example here. Right? We've got some trees in the forest. Right? Again, you might think that this one is a little bit lackluster and you want to add some color, but let's do our adjustments first. Okay? We want to add some blacks. What do we notice about the histogram? It's a little overexposed. Okay, so I'm going to add some blacks to deepen and enrichen that. I want to bring the highlights back into range, so just pulling my highlight slider. Okay, so notice I haven't adjusted the exposure at all, just blacks and highlights. Okay, I want us to make sure I have a little bit of white, which I do. Okay, give it a little bit of clarity, give it a little bit of contrast. Now let's look at a before and after. So we've adjusted everything except vibrance and saturation. Okay. So fairly flat, a little punch. The other thing is your color balance will affect your vibrance of particular colors. In this case, green is affected by blue and yellow. Okay, if we make the image bluer, it's going to have less green and less punch. If we increase the yellow or move the temperature to the right, look at how the green just comes to life. Okay? Same thing with this one. If we have more pink, it takes away from the green. Okay, so getting rid of some of that pink gives you more green. Now let's take a before and after. Okay, so before, a little dull. After, nice bright green. Haven't touched the vibrance and saturation sliders. Right? Let's take a look at the difference between those two because there is often confusion. A good example to look at is a people photo. Okay? So we're going to do this one 2 different ways. I'm going to make a virtual copy so we can do it both ways. So let's take a look at what happens when we pull the vibrance slider up. Okay? Vibrance applies to any colors which are muted or more subdued. So you can see his shirt, the ground, and the colors in the rock in the background, including some of their skin tones, have been really enhanced, but the trees, not as much. Okay? Let's do the other one and pull the saturation slider. Okay? Saturation applies to colors which are already brightly or highly saturated. So the greens have really come out, as have their skin tones. So let's look at the two. This one is vibrance. This one is saturation. So what can we learn from that? Number one thing you want to learn from that is that try and avoid oversaturation when you have people, because you're going to get people that look like they've been in a nuclear holocaust or extremely sunburned. So you want to try and avoid the use of increased saturation on people. If you want a more color, try vibrance, or a better option is to use some local adjustments and not saturate your people. Okay? A better choice is, like I said, to adjust your contrast and everything else first, and oftentimes your saturation and vibrance will fall into line. Okay? Something else you can do with saturate is you can obviously go the other direction and desaturate. So let's give that a try. Okay? So desaturate basically makes your image into a monochrome or a black and white image. There are several different ways to do black and white inside of Lightroom. This is not the way that I recommend. Okay, let's go back to our other thumbnail here, or the virtual copy. In the basic panel, you also see that there is a tab right at the top that says black and white. Okay, let's click it and see what happens. This is also not the way that I would recommend doing black and white. Both of these methods eliminate the color information for the most part, and you don't have the option of adjusting the tones individually. Okay? Let's make one more virtual copy just to give you a comparison. Let's go back to color. When you go down your develop panel a little bit on the right, you'll see something called HSL, color, and black and white. That is the way that I recommend converting to black and white. So if you click it, you'll see that you get all these little colored sliders. So your image did turn to black and white, but what happens is you get to adjust all of these tones because it still recognizes them from the original image. And you get this little targeted adjustment tool here that allows you to adjust by tone. So just like we did with exposure, I want to darken his shirt. Okay, so I'm just going to click and drag. Okay, I want to lighten their faces. Okay. People often have red or orange in skin tone. Okay, so that's a common one if you want to lighten skin tone. Let's darken his shirt even more. Again, moderation. The yellow is going to be the trees, the foliage. Okay. We could even make an infrared type of look. Okay. So you get to completely control the look of your black and white when you have sliders from the original color tones. When we look at the other two, okay, they look okay, but we don't have the control that we have over this method. Okay, so when you're doing black and white, just to reiterate, the sliders on the saturate on the basic panel here is I tend not to do it this way. Okay? Something that you might want to use the saturation slider for in the negative direction is to just do a slightly tinted picture. Okay, this is kind of a popular look where you know, turn the color down a little bit and it looks like a faded sort of old black and white. That is something that's fairly common. What I tend to do is I play with the vibrance and saturation sliders where I'll usually increase one and decrease the other. So let's take a look. When I increase vibrance and decrease saturation, we get this type of look. Okay, let's make a duplicate and let's do the other way around. Okay, so if we set saturation to the plus and vibrance to minus, okay, we get a very different look. Okay, so, oops, wrong way. Okay, so this one compared to this one. Okay, so you get to decide how you want your image to look, and you can just make a faded black and white look using, again, to moderation minus saturation. Okay. Now let's take a look at putting it all together and how we want to process an image using all of these sliders and how they come together to make your final image. Okay, I'm going to look at a sunset image here. Let's do this guy here. Okay, I'm going to reset. We adjusted the color. So let's go back to 0. So this is how it came out of camera. And it's kind of, you know, blah, doesn't have a lot of punch. We look at the histogram. There's not a lot of highlights. So what are we going to do first? Whites and blacks. Okay. First thing I'm going to do. So click Option Alt. Drag my white slider up until I get some highlights clipping. Now I'm going to look at what is clipping as well. So see these little dots that are appearing? These are actually the street lights. Okay, so I'm okay with those clipping. I might actually go a little farther. The other area that's clipping is just a little bit of this cloud up here where the sun is peeking behind. So I might actually go a little farther and then just bring it back. Perfect, right there. Okay, so let's do a before and after. So see how it's brightened it and I haven't changed the exposure. Let's do the same with the blacks. Let's have some rich black coming in there. I'm going to add a little bit of clarity. I don't want to go too far. Right? We're going to bring the highlights down. So this becomes an artistic decision. We have full detail in the highlights and we don't need to bring them down. But if we go all the way on this one, look what happens to the sky. It brings those tones back into range, and it also gives a richer color. So when the sky is a little bit darker, you get this beautiful color coming out. So I'm going to go all the way with that one. And I'm going to bring the shadow slider up to just lighten the city a little bit. Okay, so as I increase, you can see the city get a little brighter. Let's take it all the way and see what it does. Okay, and that's not so bad. So a sunset, this type of image is one that can handle extremes. I can push the highlights and the shadow sliders all the way, and I'm not going too far that the image starts to look too garish. Right? So look at the histogram now. It's nice and evenly spaced out. It touches both sides. It's got some nice contrast. Are we happy with our color? Well, let's adjust it a little bit warmer. I'm going to make a little bit more yellow, but I know that this sky was really pink when I shot it, so I'm actually going to increase the tint. Perfect. Okay, so let's do a before and after. Okay, so we had something that was fairly blah to something that is really nice and punchy and colorful. Okay. Again, you want to be careful not to go too far. If you want to brighten it, you can bring your exposure up just a tiny bit more. Okay. And you could increase your contrast. Okay. Look at how when I increase the contrast, the color saturation comes out, and I'm not touching that saturation slider. Okay. So I'm pretty happy with that. Let's take a look at our couple. Okay. So let's do a process. Let's start all over again. So reset. Let's do our whites and our blacks. Okay, we can do shift double click. You know, it brought the whites down. Okay, something I want you to be aware of here is taking your whites down too far. I'm actually going to use my option key and bring it back. Okay, so yes, her whites of her shirt are clipping a little bit, and her watch area here. Reflections, things like reflections on glass, light sources like the lights in the sunset image we just did, if those are clipping, I'm absolutely okay with that. Okay, I don't need detail in the sun, I don't need detail in a lamp or in a watch. I want to make sure that I have detail on people's faces and clothing, and we do have full detail. Okay, be really careful of bringing the highlight slider down too far on something like this, because watch her shirt, what happens when I do that. Okay, her shirt starts to look gray, almost blue. Not a good look. Okay, I'm going to warm them up a little bit. Let's just choose cloudy and see how that looks. Okay, just a quick tip. I often like cloudy for shots like this. This was shot on a cloudy day, and I will usually turn the tint down to about +6. It puts it at 10 as the default, and I find that's usually a little bit too pink. +5 or 6 is my preference. Okay, so that's looking pretty good. I'm going to bring the highlight slider down a tiny bit, but again, not very much. I'm going to bring the shadows up a little bit. I'm not going to go too far, right, because I don't want to get rid of the shadows. I just want to have a little more detail. Okay, make sure I've got blacks. Let's go a little more and add a little bit of clarity. Okay, maybe lighten them up overall just a tiny bit. Okay. So let's do a before and after. Okay, we've changed the color, we've increased the contrast, and it's a nice range. This is one that you can easily go too far with, as well as a sunset. Okay, so this one I would consider nicely processed. It's pleasing to the eye as somewhat normal skin tones. Okay, going too far is going to be something that takes the sliders all the way, and you're going to have something that looks like that. Okay, if you see images that look like this, right, and maybe we've even got a little extra saturation, I don't know about you, this is definitely not my personal preference. Okay, the skin tones are highly irregular, the green tones are highly irregular. It's not something that you would normally see with the eye, and my question is that if you were doing this processing for an effect, what is the image that's underneath? Is the image good before you added the effect, or are you adding the effect to make the image good? Right? If it's the latter, maybe you need to go back and consider shooting the image again. You want to have a good image and enhance it with the processing. You're not creating a good image out of something that wasn't to begin with. Okay? If that is the case, I would suggest going back and practicing your shooting and not your processing skills at this point. Right? So again, keep it back to more neutral. Let's go back here. The history will take you back as many steps as you want. That looks pretty good. Okay. So I like that much better than the neon people. Right? Much more natural. You can give them a little bit of vibrance if you want a little more color. And I've got some other tips for skin tone and things like that. Okay, I do also use Lightroom presets sometimes. I'm not using any right now because I want to show you how the sliders work, but I do use some presets, and I'm also going to be offering a set of basic Lightroom presets that do a lot of these things with a couple of clicks that may simplify it for you as well. So one last example I want to look at, which is going too far, is a sunset picture. Okay, so this one here, sunset, same view as the other sunset, but we had this, there was some art out here on the sidewalk, and this dog walked across, so I thought it made sort of a neat, dichotomy here between the two pictures. So let's process this one how I would like to see it, and then let's see what happens when we go too far. Okay, so we want to have some whites, we want to have some blacks, let's keep it in range, we want to have a little bit of clarity. Let's increase our shadows, maybe brighten it up a little bit, bring our highlights, our sky back down, and a little more pink. Okay, so I'm fairly happy with that. Let's look at a before and after. Okay, everything is much more visible. You can see the city lights clearly. The sky has detail. To me, this looks great. Now let's take it to extreme. Okay, if we go a lot more clarity, we're going to increase our saturation and our contrast, and we get something that looks like that. Okay. Again, this is a personal preference, so if this is the type of thing that you like, by all means, do it. Generally, it's not considered a good look. It's oversaturated. It's not what you would see occurring in nature, and your eye wants to reject it. You don't see these types of tones in the sky and these types of tones down here, okay? It just looks unnatural. To me, this is much more pleasing, albeit softer, okay? So think subtle when you're doing your processing. Everything is about subtlety. Everything is about keeping it sort of looking natural. If you tend to like to go towards the more grunge look, by all means, absolutely experiment with it, okay? But try not to go too far, is my advice. Okay, in terms of making artistic choice, I'm going to show you another one where you get to make the choice as to, do you actually want detail or not? So let's take a look at this image here, shot in a hotel. And I just like the way the light was coming in this neat old armchair or sofa here. Okay, so if we want to do our processing as we've just described and make sure that we have nice blacks and, okay, our whites are seriously clipping, so we're going to bring our highlights all the way down. Okay, I might even darken the image so that we can get some highlights. I might increase that. Okay, so we could certainly process it this way and bring the highlights into line so that there are some details outside that window. So let's look at the before and after. Right? So the window's blown out completely in the original version, right? Versus we're starting to get some detail, right? This is the range where you might get into, if you wanted to have detail in the window, you might get into bracketing and using the HDR function, which is now built into Lightroom. Lightroom 6 or CC has merged to HDR, okay? But capturing it in a single image is very difficult to retain detail inside and outside, especially when you have sun outside like that. It's so much a contrast that your camera just can't capture detail in both, right? So what I would suggest is you have to make a decision. Is this what you're happy with, or do you even care if you have detail outside the window? Right? I'm going to reset because for me, I don't need detail out the window. For me, it was about the couch and the inside, not what was going on outside. So I really like what's happening there. And the fact that the window is blown out, I don't actually need to see details. Right? For me, it feels warm and sort of glowy out the window, not having the details. So you get to make your artistic choices on something like this. Do you want detail in the highlights or not? Okay? So that's about it. Those are the ones I wanted to show you in terms of the basic slider. So remember to have fun when you're processing. I'll do one last one here. This is an interior of an old building in Havana. Again, this is something that you can pull quite far because there's a lot of texture here, and it's not going to mind if you enhance its texture. Okay? So I'm going to bring the highlights down. I'm going to give it a little bit of clarity. And I think I want to darken it a little bit to give it a bit more moodiness. Okay, so this is probably something similar to what I would do in the basic panel, and then I would take it to the next step and do some local adjustments, which I'm going to show you in a future video. So again, I'm going to leave you with, remember to play with the sliders. Don't be afraid of them. If you're working with a raw file, you can take them quite far before you start to degrade your image. And the neat thing about any of this in Lightroom or Adobe Camera Raw and Photoshop is that it's all non-destructive. You're not actually applying any of this to your image until you go to export it or save it as a new JPEG or TIFF. Right? So you have no danger of ruining your image. Play away, pull the sliders to your heart's content, and we'll see you next time.